Chapter 1. The Wool That Did Not Match. The first thing Eleanor Crewe noticed about Ashworth Hall, before she noticed the man at the door or the smell of beeswax in the entrance hall, or even the rain that had begun to fall on the gravel behind her, was the wool. There was a basket of it just inside the porch, a wide flat basket of woven willow, the sort one might use for apples, and the wool inside it had been wound into balls of varying sizes by what was clearly more than one pair of hands. Some balls were tight and almost geometrical, others were loose, a little untidy, the loose end tucked in with more haste than care, and one ball, sitting slightly apart from the others, as though it had been set down in the middle of a thought, was the wrong colour entirely. The rest were the soft heathered greys and creams of the West Country. The colours one would expect in a house that produced its own fleeces. This one was a deep ecclesiastical purple, like a bishop's stole left out in the rain. Eleanor stared at it longer than was perhaps polite, and then a voice behind her said, "Miss Crewe, welcome to Ashworth. I hope the train was bearable." She turned and found a slight grey-haired man in a tweed jacket that had been mended at the elbow, with a patch nearly but not quite the same colour. His name, she remembered from the letter, was Mr. Linnet, and he was Lady Ashworth's solicitor, and he had been the one to suggest that Eleanor, who had nursed Lady Ashworth's sister through a long illness in Bath the previous winter, might come down to Dorset for a fortnight, since her ladyship was, as he had put it, not herself. The train was perfectly civilised. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I had a compartment to myself from Yeovil. Is Lady Ashworth, is she expecting me this afternoon, or would she prefer I waited?" "She's expecting you. She's been expecting you, I should say, since Tuesday." Mr. Linnet gave a small private smile that was not really a smile. "Time has become... well, you will see for yourself." He took her case. She followed him through the entrance hall, which was panelled in a dark wood and hung with a sort of indifferent ancestral portraits that suggested several generations of ordinary-looking people who had nevertheless thought rather well of themselves. The beeswax smell was very strong here, and underneath it she could detect the cleaner, sharper smell of rain coming in through an open window somewhere upstairs. There were people in the house. She could feel that even without seeing them. A door closed on the floor above. Somewhere very faintly a kettle was being put on to boil. From the long corridor that ran off to the east she heard a low murmur. Two voices, a man and a woman, both pitched to that careful volume people use when they wish to be heard by each other, but not by anyone else. Mr. Linnet seemed not to register any of it. He was already halfway up the stairs. "Lady Ashworth keeps to her sitting room these days," he said. "It used to be the morning room, but she has had the knitting things moved in, and she finds it pleasant. There is a south window. You will find her, kindly disposed, I think." "And the household?" Eleanor said. "Forgive me. Mr. Linnet, I confess your letter was... I understood I was to nurse her ladyship, but I did not entirely understand from what." He paused on the half-landing. He did not turn around. He spoke to the wallpaper, which was a faded peony pattern that someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to clean. "Her ladyship," he said, "is in excellent physical health for a woman of 78. Her difficulty is of another kind. Her son died 8 months ago, quite suddenly, in the lake at the bottom of the south lawn. The verdict was misadventure. He had been swimming, the water was cold, his heart was... well, it was a great shock. I am very sorry. Yes," he resumed climbing. "Since then her ladyship has been vivid, shall we say. She knits a great deal, she speaks to him sometimes, not always. She is not. You must not think she is not lucid. She is extremely lucid. It is only that she has decided certain things are not to be discussed, and the rest of the household has fallen in with that decision." They had reached a long upper corridor. At the far end a door stood half open, and a wedge of pale afternoon light lay across the carpet. Eleanor could see, from where she stood, a wing-backed chair in profile, and a thin, elegant hand resting on its arm, and the steady, patient movement of knitting needles. "There is also," Mr. Linnet said, very quietly now, "a guest staying with us, an old friend of her ladyship's, from a place called St. Mary Mead. She arrived on Monday. She's been very kind." He gave Eleanor a look she could not entirely read. "She knits as well," he said. "Rather a lot." He knocked once at the half-open door, and then they went in. The room was warmer than the rest of the house. A small fire was lit, although it was only September, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the faint dry sweetness of dried lavender from a bowl on the writing desk. Lady Ashworth sat by the south window in a high-backed chair, with a tartan rug across her knees and her work in her lap. She was a tall woman, even seated, with the carved cheekbones of someone who had been beautiful in a particular cool way at 25, and had simply gone on being so without bothering to revise the style. She looked up. Her eyes were clear and a very pale blue. "Miss Crewe," she said, "how good of you. Forgive me for not rising. My hip is being tiresome today. This is my dear friend Miss Marple, who has been keeping me company. Jane, this is Eleanor, who looked after my poor sister so beautifully." In the chair on the other side of the fire, almost lost in shadow, an elderly lady in soft grey set down her knitting and smiled. "How do you do, my dear?" she said. "I do hope you weren't too damp on the journey. I was just thinking, looking at that purple wool down in the porch, it really is the most extraordinary colour, isn't it? Quite out of place. I wondered who in the world had been working with it." Lady Ashworth did not look up from her needles. "I have no idea," she said. "I never use purple." Chapter 2. A House That Listened. Eleanor was given a room in the west wing, 2 doors down from the linen cupboard, and directly above what had once been the gun room, and was now, Mr. Linnet told her on the way up, used chiefly for storing apples. It was a pleasant enough room, with a sloping ceiling and a brass bedstead and a view, through a small dormer window, of the south lawn and the lake beyond. The lake was perhaps 100 yards from the house. It was not large. It was the shape of a kidney, edged with reeds at the far end, and with a stone landing on the side nearest the lawn. A wooden boathouse stood on the eastern shore, painted a pale green that had weathered to the colour of lichen. From her window, Eleanor could see the boathouse roof and the dark water beyond it, and, at the very edge of the lawn, a single white-painted bench facing the water, as though waiting for someone to come and sit in it. She unpacked slowly. There was no particular hurry. Tea, Mr. Linnet had told her, was at 4:30, and she had nearly an hour. She put her 2 good dresses in the wardrobe and her brushes on the dressing table, and the small leather-bound diary she had brought, mostly out of habit, in the top drawer of the bedside table. She washed her hands in the basin and dried them on a towel that smelled faintly of cedar. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and tried, for a moment, to think clearly about what she'd walked into. It was not so much that the house was unhappy. Houses where someone had recently died were often unhappy, and one learned, in nursing, to feel the particular shape of that unhappiness without being unsettled by it. It was rather that the house seemed to be listening, as though everyone in it had agreed not to say certain things out loud, and the walls had taken up the habit on their own account. There had been the murmur in the east corridor when she arrived, a man and a woman, low-voiced. There had been Mr. Linnet's careful phrasing, vivid, kindly disposed, fallen in with that decision. There had been Lady Ashworth's flat refusal, pleasant as a closed door on the matter of the purple wool. And there was Miss Marple. Eleanor had not known what to make of Miss Marple. She had expected from Mr. Linnet's description an old-school friend, perhaps a clergyman's widow, perhaps a retired governess, the sort of harmless village lady one invited to a grieving house because she could be relied upon not to ask questions. Miss Marple did fit that description, in a sense. She wore soft grey wool and a small cameo brooch, and her hair was white and arranged in a slightly old-fashioned way, and she had a habit of looking up over her knitting at exactly the moment a person in the room thought she was not paying attention. But she had asked, in the very first minute of meeting, about the purple wool. And Lady Ashworth had answered her, and the answer, Eleanor was almost certain, had not been true. She did not know how she knew. Lady Ashworth's manner had been faultless. Her hands had not paused. Her voice had been perfectly even. And yet the answer had felt to Eleanor like a curtain drawn across a window, performed too smoothly to be natural, and leaving one quite certain that there was something on the other side of it. She thought, rather suddenly, of a patient she had nursed in Bath the previous spring, a Mrs. Kettering who had told her a great deal about her late husband, all of it admirable, and who had once burst into tears at the mention of a particular hymn for reasons she had refused to give. Mrs. Kettering had not been lying. She had simply been guarding a place inside herself she did not wish anyone to enter. Eleanor recognised in Lady Ashworth the same arrangement. She washed her face once more and went down to tea. Tea was in the long drawing room, which faced the lawn. It was a handsome room, slightly underfurnished, as though someone had recently removed a sofa or two, and not yet decided what to put in their place. A silver service stood on a low table by the fire, and around it were gathered 4 people Eleanor had not yet met. The first was a tall, fair-haired woman of perhaps 40, in a well-cut grey dress, who rose at once and came forward. "Miss Crewe, I'm Cynthia Ashworth, Henry's widow. Welcome. Mother has spoken of you very warmly. You must be exhausted." She had a low, pleasant voice and the trained smile of a woman who had spent her life being agreeable in difficult rooms. Her eyes, Eleanor noticed, were red at the inner corners, as though she had been crying privately and had then put on powder and come downstairs. "You're very kind," Eleanor said. "I'm so terribly sorry for your loss." "Yes, thank you. It has been... well," Cynthia turned. "May I introduce... This is Dr. Pellow, who looks after Mother, and our cousin Roderick, who is staying for a few weeks. And Miss Marple you've already met, of course." Dr. Pellow was a heavy man in his 50s, with the kind of careful, courteous manner that doctors developed in country practices, where everyone knew everyone else's grandmother. He shook her hand and asked civilly about her train. The cousin Roderick was younger, perhaps 30, with a long handsome face and the slightly restless posture of a man who had been indoors too much. "How do you do, Miss Crewe?" he said. "I trust they've put you somewhere with a view. The west rooms are the best in this house. Cynthia stuck me in the east corridor and there isn't a thing to look at except the kitchen garden wall." "I think the kitchen garden is very pretty," Cynthia said evenly, pouring tea. "It's a wall, darling." Miss Marple, in the corner by the fire, was knitting. She did not look up, but Eleanor had the distinct impression that she had heard every word, registered every inflection, and was setting them aside with the care of a woman sorting buttons into a tin. "Miss Crewe," Miss Marple said when at last Eleanor had been given her cup, "do come and sit by me, my dear. The fire is so welcome on a wet afternoon. I was just thinking how very like Ashworth it is to my own little corner of the world. Country houses do all rather rhyme with one another, don't they, in their way?" Eleanor sat. The cup in her hand was very thin and old, the gilding worn down on the rim where generations of thumbs had pressed. "You're from a village," she said. "Mr. Linnet mentioned, St. Mary Mead." "Yes, indeed, a very small place. We have rather more vicars than one would think strictly necessary, and not nearly enough roads. It does mean one comes to know one's neighbours, however." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "I was thinking, as Mr. Roderick spoke just now, of a young man we had in St. Mary Mead some years ago. Tom Hadley, his name was, a nephew of old Colonel Hadley at the rectory cottages. Tom was a perfectly charming young man, but he had never quite forgiven his cousins for inheriting the small piece of land he had been promised as a boy. He used to make the lightest little jokes about it. Quite witty. Everyone laughed, and you know for years no one realised he was perfectly serious." She glanced up, only for the briefest moment, and her pale blue eyes met Eleanor's. "It is so easy," she said gently, "to mistake a real grievance for a joke when the person making it has nice manners." She returned to her knitting. Across the room, Roderick laughed at something Dr. Pellow had said, a laugh slightly too loud for the joke. Eleanor lowered her cup carefully into its saucer. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I am going to need to be very careful in this house." Chapter 3. 3 things that did not fit on her second day at Ashworth between breakfast and luncheon. Eleanor took a walk down to the lake. She had not planned to. She had meant only to stretch her legs in the rose garden, which Mr. Linnet had recommended, and which lay on the eastern side of the house behind a low yew hedge. But the rose garden, when she reached it, was the sort of place that wanted to be sat in rather than walked through, and she was not yet ready to sit. So she had come back through the wrought-iron gate, crossed the gravel path, and gone down the south lawn instead, past the white bench, past a ragged border of late asters, down to where the grass softened into reeds at the lake's edge. It was a still grey morning. The water looked almost solid, like polished slate. There was no wind to ruffle it, only the occasional dimpling that meant a fish coming up, or possibly only a beetle. The boathouse was locked. She tried the door and rattled the hasp politely and gave it up. There was a small window in the side wall, however, and by standing on tiptoe she could see in through the dusty glass. A wooden punt drawn up on rollers, a coil of rope on a hook, 2 oars laid across pegs, and on the far wall a row of 3 tin hooks of which the middle one was empty. She stood looking at the empty hook for a long moment without quite knowing why. Then a voice behind her said, "It used to have a lifebelt on it. A round one. Cork, with a canvas cover. Henry's father bought it in 1912, I believe, after some friend's child fell in off the landing." Eleanor turned. Miss Marple was standing on the path a few feet away, in her grey coat and a soft hat, with a small wicker basket over one arm. There were 2 apples in the basket and a pair of secateurs and a folded handkerchief. "I did not hear you come down," Eleanor said. "No, dear. The grass is so wet, one walks very quietly. I came out for a little air. The house is rather close in the mornings." Miss Marple smiled and looked past Eleanor at the boathouse. The lifebelt was taken down some weeks after Henry died. Cynthia mentioned it to me on Tuesday. She said she could not bear to look at it any longer. I thought that was perfectly natural. "Yes," Eleanor said slowly. "Yes, of course." "Although," Miss Marple said, "it does mean, of course, that one can no longer tell whether it was on its hook the night Henry went into the water." She said this in exactly the same gentle, conversational tone, looking at the apples in her basket. Eleanor said nothing. The lake sat between them like a held breath. "I am so sorry," Miss Marple said. "I do tend to think aloud. It is a habit one falls into living alone. Shall we walk back together? I want to ask Cook about a recipe for damson jelly. She has a way of getting it to set that I have never quite mastered, and I'm too proud not to want to learn." They walked back across the lawn. Miss Marple talked comfortably and at no great speed about damsons, and about the difficulty of finding good muslin for jelly bags, and about a Mrs. Pettigrew of St. Mary Mead, who had once tried to substitute butter muslin and produced something very sad. Eleanor listened. She also, without quite meaning to, began to count. There were, she realised by the time they reached the gravel, 3 things in this house that did not fit. The first was the purple wool sitting in a basket of greys and creams in the porch, in a household where Lady Ashworth said with perfect evenness that she never used purple. The second was the empty hook in the boathouse, where a lifebelt had once hung, removed at a sister-in-law's discretion before any inquiry could observe whether it had hung there on a particular September night. And the third was Roderick. Roderick the cousin, who had laughed too loud at Dr. Pello's mild joke yesterday, and who had complained about his bedroom in front of a recently widowed woman at her own tea table, and who had, at dinner the night before, when the conversation had touched briefly on Henry, looked down at his plate in a manner that was not quite grief, and not quite indifference, but something more careful than either. She did not yet know what any of these 3 things meant. She said, on the gravel, "Miss Marple, if I might, you were a friend of Lady Ashworth's before, from a long time ago?" "Oh, not so very long," Miss Marple said. 40 years, perhaps. We met at a wedding. I was the bride's cousin, and Edith, Lady Ashworth, was a friend of the groom's sister. We took to one another at once. I have a great fondness for her. She's not, you know, an easy woman to be fond of. She does not invite it. One has to choose to do it." She glanced sideways at Eleanor. "I was very glad when Mr. Linnet wrote to me. I've been very glad to come." "Mr. Linnet wrote to you," Eleanor said. "Yes, dear, about a month ago. He was concerned about Edith. He felt, I believe, that there were certain currents in the household which he could not quite address as the family solicitor, but which a private friend of long standing might gently look into. He has been most considerate." She said this in exactly the tone in which she had spoken about damsons. Eleanor stopped walking. "Miss Marple," she said, "forgive me. Did Henry Ashworth's death... Was there any question that it was not?" "There has been no question raised," Miss Marple said gently. "None at all. Dr. Pello signed the certificate. The coroner was satisfied. Henry had a weak heart, you see. Quite a serious condition, although he did not like it discussed. And he had insisted on swimming in cold water against medical advice for some years. It was misadventure. Everyone is in agreement." A small wind moved across the lawn behind them. Somewhere in the house, a window was being closed. "Only," Miss Marple said, "Edith has not been quite herself since, and I have been wondering, my dear, only wondering, mind, whether she's grieving for her son, or whether she's grieving for something rather more particular than that." She lifted her basket slightly and went on toward the kitchen door. Eleanor stood on the gravel a moment longer. Then she followed. Chapter 4. What Cynthia said at the bottom of the stairs. That evening, as Eleanor was coming down to dinner, She heard Cynthia Ashworth speaking on the telephone in the small study off the entrance hall. The door was not properly closed. It stood at that careless half-inch which suggested someone had pulled it to without checking. The lamp inside threw a thin bar of yellow light across the stone flags of the corridor, and Cynthia's voice came clearly through the gap, low and tense and quite unlike the practised pleasantness she'd used at tea. "I have told you, I cannot. Not while Mother is like this. No, no, Geoffrey, listen to me. You must give me until the autumn at least. By Christmas it will be. Yes, yes, I know what we agreed. I have not forgotten what we agreed." A pause. Eleanor stood very still on the third stair, her hand on the banister, aware that to move at all now was to be heard. "You must trust me," Cynthia said. Have I ever once let you down in this? No. Then you must trust me a little longer. The house is full of... There are too many people here. There is a nurse companion now from Bath. There is Mother's old friend Miss Marple, who notices... I don't know what she notices, but she notices. And there is Roderick, who is being intolerable. I cannot do anything until they have all gone. Another pause. Whoever Geoffrey was, he was speaking now, and Eleanor could not hear him. "I am not putting you off," Cynthia said more quietly. "I am asking you to be patient, as I have been patient. For 11 years I have been patient. Surely a few more months." The receiver was set down, not slammed. Set down, with the controlled care of a woman who had a great deal of practice in not slamming things. Eleanor went back up 2 stairs as silently as she could, then came down again at her ordinary pace, allowing her shoes to make their ordinary sound on the boards. As she reached the bottom, Cynthia came out of the study smiling and said, "Oh, there you are, Miss Crewe. I was just telephoning to confirm Mother's appointment with Dr. Pellow next week. Shall we go in? Cook has made one of her pies and she's anxious." "Of course," Eleanor said. Cynthia's smile was very steady. Her eyes, Eleanor thought, were the colour of the lake at noon, when the light went silver on it, and you could not quite see what was underneath. At dinner there were 6 of them. Lady Ashworth, who had come down for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, and sat at the head of the table in a gown of dark green silk, Cynthia at the foot, Miss Marple and Eleanor on one side, and Roderick and Dr. Pellow opposite. Mr. Linnet, who had been present at luncheon, had returned to his rooms in the village. The conversation was light and slightly stiff. They spoke of the weather, which was uncertain, and of the church fete which had been postponed, and of a new book on the cathedrals of Wessex which Dr. Pellow had been reading, and which he recommended to the table at large in tones of mild enthusiasm. No one mentioned Henry, no one mentioned the lake. No one mentioned the purple wool. Roderick drank rather more than he ate. He was charming over the soup and quieter over the fish, and by the time the pie arrived, he had reached the stage where every remark was not quite directly addressed to anyone, but seemed to be flung into the centre of the table for whoever cared to pick it up. "I had a letter from Aunt Marigold this morning," he said, to no one in particular. "Such a curious letter. She writes that she's thinking of redoing her will. At her age, one would have thought she had finished with all that years ago." Lady Ashworth went on cutting her fish into very small pieces with great precision. "I do think," Roderick said, "that old people make far too much fuss about their wills, as though the world will end because some piece of furniture has gone to the wrong nephew." "Don't you think, Aunt Edith?" Lady Ashworth looked up. Her pale blue eyes rested on him for a very long second. "I think," she said, "that the wishes of the dying are the only wishes most people ever take entirely seriously. I find that rather a sad commentary on the rest of life. Will you pass the salt, Roderick? It is just by your wine glass, I think." He passed the salt. He said nothing more for a while. After dinner, Lady Ashworth went up at once, with Cynthia attending her. Dr. Pellow excused himself. He had a patient at the home farm, he said, and he would walk back across the fields. Roderick announced, to the room and to the decanter, that he was going to take a turn outside before bed. The dining room emptied. Eleanor and Miss Marple were left at the table, which had been cleared except for a single bowl of late roses and the remains of 2 glasses of wine. "Well," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I did not catch the name on the telephone," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I heard the tone, my dear. I was just outside the door of the morning room. It is awkward, the way that corridor carries voices. Was it Geoffrey?" Eleanor looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it was Geoffrey." Miss Marple turned her wine-glass in her fingers without drinking. 11 years, she said. That is a very long patience. 11 years. Far longer than most marriages. I wonder. Miss Marple, Eleanor said carefully, what exactly do you suspect? The old lady was quiet a moment. Then she said, I do not yet, my dear, suspect anything at all. I have only noticed that there is a great deal of grief in this house, and that almost none of it is attached to the person it ought to be attached to. Lady Ashworth is grieving, yes, but she is not, I think, grieving for her son. Not in the way mothers do. She is grieving for something she did, or something she failed to do, or something she has only just understood. And until I know which of those three it is, I cannot be of any use to her at all. She set down the glass. I think, she said, I shall ask her tomorrow about the purple wool. Chapter 5. The photograph in the knitting bag. Lady Ashworth's sitting room by daylight was a kinder room than it had seemed on Eleanor's first afternoon. The fire was small, but the south window let in a great deal of light, and the light fell across a worn Turkey carpet, a pair of low armchairs, a writing desk that had once been a good piece of furniture and was now patient with use, and a great quantity of knitting. The knitting was everywhere. There was a half-finished shawl draped over one chair back, in the soft heathered grey Eleanor had seen in the porch basket. There was a tray on the window seat with 3 balls of cream wool and a pair of long bone needles. There was a Fair Isle sleeve, still on its needles, lying across the arm of Lady Ashworth's chair as though set aside mid-thought, and on the small footstool by her ladyship's chair there was a knitting bag, an old tapestry bag, faded, with a wooden handle. Miss Marple that morning did not come straight to the point. She rarely did. She and Lady Ashworth sat by the fire for some time and spoke of a woman they had both known years ago, a Mrs. Hartnell, who had run the parish flower rota in a village near Swanage, and had at last died at 91 with all her opinions undimmed. They spoke of the difficulty of finding a good fishmonger in the country. They spoke of Cynthia, and of how well Cynthia had managed in the last year, and of the strain it must have been on her. Eleanor sat in the window seat with a book open on her lap, and turned a page now and then for the sake of plausibility. She was not really expected to take part. She understood, with the clarity she had developed during many years of nursing, that her function in this room was simply to be a presence, in front of which Lady Ashworth could not entirely retreat, a kindly stranger whose existence forced a little ordinary politeness into the air. At length Miss Marple said very mildly, "Edith, my dear, I have been wondering. There is a ball of purple wool in the basket downstairs, the most striking colour. Do you happen to know whose it is?" Lady Ashworth did not look up from her needles. "I cannot imagine," she said. "Cynthia takes in work for the church sometimes, bonnets for the missionary boxes, that sort of thing. It will be left over from one of her projects, I expect. I never use purple." "No," Miss Marple said. "No, I remember. You always preferred the natural shades, even at school. You had a grey jumper at school that I rather coveted." "Did I?" "Oh, yes. I was a good deal plumper than you in those days, and grey did not flatter me at all. I held it against you for nearly a term." Lady Ashworth smiled, very faintly. "I do not remember that." "No reason you should." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "It is only, forgive me, dear, I happen to notice that there is a rather similar shade of purple in the wool you have in your bag. Just there, at the top. I thought perhaps you had taken to it after all." There was a pause. Eleanor, without raising her eyes from her book, felt the air in the room change. "You must be mistaken, Jane," Lady Ashworth said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I have nothing of that colour." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "How silly of me! The light through the window plays tricks at this hour. Forgive an old woman's eyes." She returned to her own knitting. Lady Ashworth returned to hers. The conversation moved, gracefully, and at no one's particular instigation, on to the question of whether the church organ was finally beyond repair. 20 minutes later, Lady Ashworth rang the small handbell on the table beside her and asked the maid. When she came to bring up a fresh pot of tea, the maid went. Lady Ashworth said she would slip down to the bathroom while they waited. Her hip was tolerable today, and a little movement was good for it. She rose with the slight stiffness of a woman who had once been graceful and was now careful, and went out. Miss Marple set down her work. "Eleanor, dear," she said, "would you do me a very great favour?" "Of course." "Look in the bag." Eleanor looked at her. "I would do it myself," Miss Marple said, "but my back is not what it was, and I cannot bend to a footstool without a dreadful business. Just see what is in there. Quickly, please." Eleanor crossed the room and knelt by the footstool. The tapestry bag was open at the top. There was wool inside it, a quantity of the cream and the heathered grey, and near the top, half tucked under a folded knitting pattern, a single small ball of the deep ecclesiastical purple from the basket downstairs. Beneath the wool, her fingers found something firm and flat. She drew it out far enough to see. It was a photograph in a small silver frame, face down, the velvet backing worn at the corners. She turned it over. It showed a young man, perhaps 25, in tennis whites, leaning against a wooden gate. He was laughing, his head thrown slightly back. He was very handsome in an uncomplicated sunlit way. Behind him, blurred but recognisable, stood a younger Lady Ashworth, a tall, slim woman in a pale dress, watching him with a kind of unguarded tenderness Eleanor had not seen on her face in any room of this house. The young man was not, Eleanor was almost certain, Henry Ashworth. She had seen Henry's portrait in the corridor outside the dining room, a heavier, sandy-haired man with his mother's cool eyes. Pencilled on the back of the frame, in a sloping hand, were 2 words and a date. Geoffrey, July 1898. Eleanor heard, very faintly, a footfall in the corridor. She slid the photograph back into the bag beneath the wool, exactly as she had found it. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and was at the window seat with her book reopened on her lap by the time Lady Ashworth came back through the door. "There," Lady Ashworth said pleasantly. "Now where had we got to? I think we had condemned the organ, and were about to start on the vicar." Miss Marple smiled and picked up her knitting, and made some gentle reply about the vicar, and did not look at Eleanor at all. Only when, half an hour later, they were on the landing together and out of earshot of the sitting room, did Miss Marple murmur, "And?" "A photograph," Eleanor said. "A young man, not Henry. The name is Geoffrey. The date is 1898. Miss Marple was very still on the landing for a moment. The sun, coming through the long window above the stairs, lit the white of her hair. 1898, she said. How extraordinary. Lady Ashworth was married in 1899, to Sir Henry's father, of course. I was at the wedding. I've just been telling you so. She walked on toward her own room. "It is a strange thing, Eleanor," she said over her shoulder. "How the dead often come back not at the moment of someone else's death, but at the moment when a secret about them is at last in danger of being told." Chapter 6. A Visitor on the Lane Mister. Linnet came up to the house the following morning, as he did most weekday mornings, to attend to Lady Ashworth's correspondence and the small ongoing business of the estate. He installed himself, as usual, in the morning room, which was no longer a morning room, a small panelled chamber on the ground floor with a green leather-topped desk and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden wall. Eleanor, who had been asked by Cynthia to take down a list of items needed from the village, found him there at about 10:30. He rose at once, with the courtesy he extended to everyone, and said he had nearly finished, and would she care to wait a moment? She said she would, and stood by the window and the kitchen garden wall, old red brick, gone soft in places, with a pear tree fanned out against it, looked exactly as it ought to look on a September morning, and she found that this was in itself oddly comforting. "Mr. Linnet," she said after a short silence. "Yes, Miss Crewe." "May I ask you a question that is not really my business?" He smiled, very slightly. He had a thin, ascetic face, and the smile transformed it briefly into something kinder. "I am a country solicitor, Miss Crewe. I do almost nothing all day except answer questions that are not really anyone's business." "Henry Ashworth," she said. "Sir Henry. He had a brother, did he not? The portrait's in the corridor. There are 2 young men in the same kind of tennis dress in 2 different frames. They are clearly brothers. The other is darker." "Yes," Mr. Linnet said. "There was a brother, Geoffrey. The younger by 4 years." Eleanor did not move. The pear tree on the wall did not move. The morning held its small patient noises. "Was," she said. "He died in 1898. He was 25 years old. He was—" Mr. Linnet considered his words. "He was the favourite. There is no kinder way to put it. Sir Henry's father preferred Henry, who was steady. Lady Ashworth preferred Geoffrey, who was not. After his death she wore black for 2 full years, which was more than was usual even then. She has never spoken of him in my hearing. The household has, by long understanding, not raised the subject." "How did he die?" "He drowned," Mr. Linnet said. "In the lake at the bottom of the south lawn. It was a hot July. He had been swimming. He was a strong swimmer." There was a verdict of misadventure. Eleanor sat down rather slowly on the edge of the chair behind her. Misadventure, she said. Yes. As with Henry. As with Henry, Mr. Linnet said. He looked at his desk and at his pen and at his hands. He spoke very carefully. I was a young man at the time of the first death, articled to my father, who was Lady Ashworth's solicitor before me. I remember it. There was, at the time, some little awkwardness. Geoffrey had become engaged that spring to a young woman of whom his family did not entirely approve. The engagement had been broken off, at his family's pressure, only a fortnight before he died. He had taken the breaking off badly. There was a certain amount of speculation in the village Brainville about whether the misadventure was quite the right word. You mean he killed himself? I mean, Mr. Linnet said, that there was speculation. My father did not encourage it. The verdict was misadventure. The matter was closed. And Henry, Eleanor said, 8 months ago, was Henry a strong swimmer? Henry, Mr. Linnet said, had been forbidden by Dr. Pellow to swim at all, on account of his heart. He had gone on swimming. He was that kind of man. The night he died, he had gone down to the lake after dinner. He liked to swim in the dark when the weather was warm. It was a warm September. He did not come back. And the lifebelt. Mr. Linnet looked up at her sharply. It was a small movement, but a very precise one. Miss Crewe, he said, what do you know about the lifebelt? Only that it is no longer on its hook in the boathouse. Cynthia, Lady Ashworth, the younger Lady Ashworth, had it taken down, so Miss Marple tells me. Mr. Linnet was silent for a moment. Then he said, It was on its hook the morning of Henry's death. I noticed it myself. I'd gone down to the lake with the gardener and one of the boys when he was found. The lifebelt was hanging where it had always hung. It had not been used. Whether Henry had tried to reach it, I cannot say. He may not have had time. And Cynthia took it down. When? 3 weeks later. She said she could not bear it. I thought that was natural enough. Eleanor stood up. She felt unaccountably steady, as though the morning had simply rearranged itself around a new fact and was waiting to see what she would do. Mr. Linnet, she said, may I ask one more thing? You wrote to Miss Marple a month ago, asking her to come. I did? Why? He set down his pen. Because, he said, Lady Ashworth altered her will 3 weeks before Henry died. The alteration was small, a single codicil, but it was unusual, and she did it in some distress, and she made me swear not to discuss it with any member of the family. She has not mentioned it since. She has not asked to see the codicil. She has not asked me to undo it. And in the 8 months since Henry's death she has not, so far as I am aware, slept properly through a single night. I am her solicitor, Miss Crewe. I am not her confessor. I have been a great many years in this profession, and I have learned that it is not my task to ask my clients what they are afraid of. But I have also learned that when an old and excellent woman alters her will in distress, and her son dies 3 weeks later in a lake, and she begins to grieve in a way that does not look quite like grief, it is sometimes useful to have in the house a person of unusual quietness, who has known her since girlhood, and who is in no hurry. That is all. He picked up his pen again. The interview, in the small, considerate way of country solicitors, was over. Eleanor said, Thank you, Mr. Linnet. Not at all, Miss Crewe. Will you remind Lady Ashworth, the younger Lady Ashworth, that I shall need her signature on the lease for the home farm before the end of the week? I will. She closed the door behind her quietly. In the corridor outside, the sun came in through the long west window in a column of pale gold, and dust moved gently in the column, and somewhere very far away in the house, a piano was being played, badly and hesitantly with one finger. Chapter 7. What Roderick Had to Sell. She found him, as she had half expected to, in the gun-room. It was no longer a gun-room. The guns had been sold or given away or simply taken down, in the way that the contents of country houses quietly seeped out of them in the years after the war. What remained was a cool flagged room with a deep stone sink, a long deal table, and the particular sweet smell of stored apples. Beauty of Bath and Cox's orange pippin, laid out on slatted shelves along one wall, each on its own square of newspaper. Roderick was sitting on the table, smoking, with the door propped open behind him onto the little flagged yard. He was in shirt sleeves, his jacket flung over a chair, and he looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had been waiting for something disagreeable to happen, and was surprised to find that it still had not. He glanced up. Miss Crewe, come to count the apples. I'm afraid I've lost track. There were 3 beauty of baths gone soft, which I have very heroically thrown into the bucket. I came to find you, actually. Good heavens. He set the cigarette carefully on the edge of a tin lid. Whatever for? She came in and shut the door behind her. The yard noises, a dog barking somewhere distant, a tap dripping in the scullery became muffled and small. Mr. Ashworth, she said, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I should like a direct answer if you can manage it. Are you blackmailing your aunt? For a moment she thought he was going to laugh. His face went through the preparatory motions, the slight upward tilt of the chin, the half smile of a man about to deflect, and then, quite suddenly, the motions failed. He sat very still. He looked at the cigarette burning slowly on the tin lid. That is, he said at last, an extraordinary question, Miss Crewe. From a nurse companion who has been in the house 4 days. Yes, I know. What on earth makes you think I would do such a thing? Several things. You quarrel with no one and yet you make everyone uncomfortable. You arrived 3 weeks ago and there is no clear reason for your visit. You raised the subject of wills at dinner the night before last in a way that was not quite a joke. You drink more than you eat. And Cynthia is afraid of you. He looked up sharply at that. Cynthia is not afraid of me. She's afraid of what you might say. It is not the same thing, but it has the same effect. He was silent for a long time. The apple smell sat between them. Somewhere on the slatted shelves a Cox's orange pippin gave a small dry sound, as it shifted on its newspaper. Miss Crewe, he said, are you going to tell anyone of this conversation? That depends entirely on what you say and the rest of it. He laughed, but it was a different laugh from the one he used at the dinner table. Drier, more honest, almost relieved. He picked up the cigarette and drew on it once and put it down again. Yes, he said. I suppose I am, although blackmail is a strong word. I would prefer to call it applied family feeling. Tell me, will you sit down? You make me feel sentenced. She sat down on the chair with his jacket on it. He did not move from the table. Geoffrey Ashworth, he said. My great-uncle Geoffrey, who drowned at 25, was not the saint the family makes him out to be. He had a child, with a girl in the village called Mary Trent. He had promised to marry her. He had broken off his engagement to a girl in Bath in order to do it, although no one in the family ever told it that way round. The Bath girl was the one they spoke of, the one they disapproved of, the one whose name they used to explain why he was unhappy. The truth was, he was unhappy because his family had told him that if he married Mary Trent they would cut him off entirely. He was a younger son with no profession. He had nothing of his own, and so he went down to the lake, after dinner, on the 20th of July 1898, and he did not come up. Eleanor said nothing. Mary Trent had the child, Roderick said. A boy. She left the village. She married eventually. A man in Plymouth, a perfectly decent man, and she died in 1915. The boy grew up not knowing whose son he was. She left him a letter to be opened on his 30th birthday. He opened it. He told no one. He carried the secret quietly for a great many years. He had a son of his own in due course. That son is me. You are. I am the great-grandson of the favourite son of this house. I am the only living male descendant of that line. I have, somewhere in a deed box in Plymouth, a letter from a dying woman, and her marriage lines and my grandfather's birth certificate, and a quantity of other small, careful documents that a woman like Mary Trent would naturally have kept. I have a perfectly clear case. I have been told by 2 London solicitors that I have a perfectly clear case. I do not, you will please notice, want the title. I have no use for being a baronet. I want a sum of money, a specific sum of money agreed between Cynthia and myself, in return for which the documents go into the fire and I go to South Africa, where I have been offered a position, and Ashworth Hall is no further troubled by the existence of a person whose grandfather had a different name on his birth certificate from the one history was willing to give him. He paused. It was Cynthia I approached, he said, not Aunt Edith. I would not have done that to her. Cynthia agreed in principle. Cynthia is, whatever else she is, a practical woman. We have not yet agreed on the sum. And Henry? Henry knew nothing. Henry was an excellent fellow, and I was sorry when he died, and I was sorrier still that his death made things easier. A baronetcy in the hands of a widow with no son is a less troublesome thing to negotiate against than a baronetcy in the hands of a baronet. Eleanor watched him. She watched the slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his hand rested on the table edge with the fingers slightly curled, the way he had said the word easier. She thought of the man on the telephone last night. Geoffrey. Cynthia using the name Geoffrey on a telephone call about money, 11 years. "Mr. Ashworth," she said carefully, "the night Henry died, where were you?" He looked at her without offence. "In Plymouth," he said, "at the Royal Hotel in front of a great many witnesses, including the manager and a man called Furnival who is a dentist. I can produce, if you really require it, a hotel bill. I was there for 3 days. I'd not yet introduced myself to Cynthia at that point. I was assembling the documents. The first time you came here was 3 weeks ago, as you say. I had decided I had a stronger hand if I were physically present. I was right about that, although it has not been a comfortable visit." He picked up the cigarette and stubbed it out at last with finality. "Miss Crewe," he said, "I am not by my own lights a wicked man. I am not even, by ordinary standards, a particularly bad one. I am only a man whose great-grandmother was lied about for 50 years and who has decided, somewhat late, to be paid for that lie. If you wish to despise me, you must do it on those terms and not on others." She rose. "I do not wish to despise you," she said. "I only wish to know one more thing. The name Geoffrey on the telephone last night, that was you." "That was me." "Cynthia called you Geoffrey." "Yes, it is a private joke. I asked her to. I thought, when I first came, that she ought to be reminded daily of whose great-grandson she was bargaining with. It has rather lost its charm for both of us." Eleanor went out, closing the door behind her. In the flagged corridor outside the gun room, she leaned for a moment against the wall and felt behind her shoulder blades the small, steady cool of a house that had stood there for 200 years and did not on the whole mind. She thought, then it is not him. And then she thought, then who? Chapter 8. A very reasonable explanation. Miss Marple, when Eleanor told her, listened in complete silence and went on knitting, and at the end said only, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, I had been afraid of something of the sort." They were in Miss Marple's bedroom, which was a small, comfortable chamber overlooking the rose garden. Miss Marple sat by the window in a small upholstered chair. Eleanor sat on the foot of the bed. Outside, a thrush was working on a snail with the patient, unsentimental rhythm of a thrush, and the sound of it, small, dry, repeated tap, gave the conversation a curious, almost domestic undertone. "You had been afraid of it?" Eleanor said. "Of the existence of another claimant?" "Yes, Edith, Lady Ashworth, has been frightened of something for a long time, considerably longer than 8 months. I've been here a week, and I have come to believe that it is not Henry's death that is haunting her. It is something older, something that has been waiting in her house for a very long time, and that the events of the last year have brought finally to her door. You think she knew about Mary Trent, about the child?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that no one of Edith's intelligence married into the family she married into could have failed to know. Country houses do not keep that sort of secret from the women who run them. Maids know, and maids have mothers, and the mothers talk. Edith was a young bride in a house that had recently lost its darling son, and she will have understood very early that her own husband had been raised in the shadow of his brother's preferment. She will also have understood, I think, what the village said about Mary Trent. She made, I would imagine, a quite deliberate decision, very young, to know what was true and to behave as though she did not. It is a thing women in her position have done for centuries. It is not always wicked. It is sometimes only the price of staying. And the codicil to her will, the one Mr. Linnet mentioned. I don't know what is in the codicil, my dear, but I can guess. 3 weeks before Henry died, Edith altered her will. She did so in distress. She did so in secret. She did so without telling Henry or Cynthia or anyone in the household. I am only guessing, but I think, that Edith decided in the autumn of last year that she had carried the lie about Mary Trent's child long enough, and I think she meant to set part of it right. With money. In her will. Privately. You mean she meant to leave money? To Geoffrey's descendants? To Roderick? To whomever Mr. Linnet could find when the time came. I do not think she knew, at the time of the codicil, that Roderick existed. I think she only knew that there was a moral debt and that she meant at last to honour it. Then why is she frightened? Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. The thrush, outside, had finished with its snail and gone elsewhere. Because she has come to believe, Miss Marple said gently, that someone in this household discovered the codicil and acted to prevent it taking effect. Eleanor stared at her. You think Henry was killed? I think Edith fears it. I think she has feared it since the morning he was found, and I think the reason she is grieving so strangely is that she is grieving a son she may herself have killed by altering her will 3 weeks before he died in a house where someone was reading her letters. But Henry was not the threat to the codicil. Henry was the heir. The codicil would only have taken a small part of his inheritance. Yes, Miss Marple said. Yes, that is the difficulty, isn't it? Killing Henry would not in itself prevent the codicil. It would not prevent anything. So either Henry's death is unrelated, which is possible, my dear, perfectly possible, or someone in this house had a quite separate reason for wanting Henry out of it, and the codicil and Mary Trent and poor Geoffrey are something rather different. A mirror Edith is holding up to her own life, in which she sees Henry's death reflected and assumes she caused it. That is a great deal to assume. Yes, said Miss Marple, I know. I have been turning it about for 3 days. I do not yet have it right. She set down her knitting. Eleanor, tell me about Cynthia. Tell me everything you have noticed about Cynthia since you arrived. Not what she has said. What you have noticed, Eleanor thought. She's very controlled, she said slowly. She runs the house beautifully. She's gentle with Lady Ashworth. She's been kind to me without being warm. When she came to greet me on the first afternoon, her eyes were red, but only at the inner corners. She had been crying and she had powdered, and she had come down. She had done all that before tea. She's the sort of woman who does her crying on a schedule. Yes. She told Roderick on the telephone that for 11 years she had been patient. That is, Henry and Cynthia were married. I worked it out at dinner. 12 years ago, there was a child, a daughter, who died at 18 months of croup the year after they married. There has been no other child. Yes. She wears no jewellery in the daytime except her wedding ring and a small gold cross. At dinner she wears 1 strand of pearls. They are her own. They were her mother's, Mr. Linnet told me. She has never, that I have seen, worn anything that belonged to Henry's family. That is interesting. And she, Eleanor hesitated. She's in the south wing more than she needs to be. There is a small sewing room there on the upper floor. She goes there in the afternoons. She has told me twice that she goes there to be quiet. I have walked past the door. There is no sound of sewing. What is she doing in there, do you suppose? I do not know. Reading, writing, sitting. Crying without powder, perhaps, Miss Marple considered. Eleanor, she said, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go to Cynthia tomorrow morning and ask her for the use of a writing desk for the afternoon. Tell her you have letters to write, and that the desk in your room is too small. Ask her, please, if you might use the small desk in the sewing room in the south wing. Do not ask whether the room is hers, simply ask whether you may use the desk. Why? Because I want to see what she says, and what she does immediately afterwards. And if she agrees? If she agrees, said Miss Marple, you must use the desk, and you must look, without disturbing anything, my dear. Without disturbing anything at all? At what is in the lower left-hand drawer? How do you know there is something in the lower left-hand drawer? I do not know it, dear, but it is the drawer in which a woman of Cynthia's habits would keep the things she did not wish to be found. Right-handed women, Eleanor, when they wish to hide a thing, put it on the left because they do not reach for it absently, and the lower drawer because the upper is open too often. I have known, in St. Mary Mead, 3 women who concealed correspondence in precisely that drawer. One of them was the vicar's wife, and the correspondence was with a quite different vicar in Norfolk. None of these women, you understand, was a wicked woman. Each of them was a woman in pain. She picked up her knitting again. The needles resumed their soft, regular click. Cynthia, Miss Marple said softly, is a woman in pain. I should like to know which kind. Chapter 9. The lower left-hand drawer. Cynthia agreed at once. She agreed almost too easily, Eleanor thought afterwards, with the smooth, unhesitating courtesy of a woman who had decided long ago that any small request from anyone would be granted, on the principle that small generosities cost nothing and bought a great deal of ordinary peace. Of course, Miss Crewe, the desk in the sewing room is yours for the afternoon. The light is good there until about 4. I shall be downstairs with Mother. Take your time. She handed Eleanor a small key. You will need this for the desk itself. The drawers stick a little. The whole house sticks a little in damp weather," she smiled. Eleanor returned the smile and went upstairs with the key in her hand, and a sense, quite clear and quite private, that she had been entrusted with something on the assumption that she would not understand what she was looking at. The sewing room was on the upper floor of the south wing at the end of a short corridor. It was a small square room papered in a faded yellow stripe, with a window that looked out across a stretch of lawn to the corner of the lake. There was a sewing machine on a table by the wall, a chair beside it, an old chaise longue under the window with a folded plaid blanket. Against the far wall stood a small writing desk of plain mahogany, with 2 short drawers above and 2 longer drawers beneath. A blotter lay on top, and a glass inkwell, and a small wooden stand holding 3 pens. Eleanor sat down. She unlocked the desk. She opened, first, the upper drawers, the obvious ones, the unimportant ones. They held what one would expect: a packet of writing paper, a box of envelopes, a leather notebook with a list of household linen in Cynthia's neat hand, a collection of stamps, a pair of scissors with 1 broken handle, a small tin of sealing wax in the dark green of the Ashworth seal. She closed those drawers. She wrote, for the look of the thing, a half-page of letter to a cousin in Bath whom she had not seen in 2 years. She set down the pen. She listened. The house was quiet. From the south window the lake sat motionless beyond the lawn. From the corridor outside there was no sound at all. She opened the lower right-hand drawer first. It held a stack of old church bulletins, a rolled-up tape measure, 2 or 3 picture postcards from Cromer addressed to Mrs. H. Ashworth, in an unfamiliar hand and dated 5 years before, and a small tin of throat lozenges. She closed that drawer. She opened the lower left-hand drawer. It was deeper than she had expected. At the front lay a folded shawl in a soft fawn colour, the kind of thing one might wrap around one's shoulders on a cool evening. Beneath the shawl was a long flat tin, the sort that had once held biscuits and was now repurposed, as such tins always were in country houses for some other use. She lifted the tin out. It was light. She set it on the blotter. She opened it. Inside were letters. There were perhaps 30 of them, tied loosely with a piece of dark green ribbon. The paper of each was the same, a good thick cream-laid paper unmarked at the head. The handwriting was the same on every envelope. It was a man's hand, sloping slightly to the right, very legible, the sort of hand a doctor or a clergyman or a country solicitor might have if he wrote a great many letters and took some quiet pride in being read easily. The letters were addressed not to Cynthia. They were addressed, every one of them, to Mrs. Henry Ashworth. The most recent letter, on the top of the bundle, was dated 3 weeks ago. It was not, however, the letter that stopped Eleanor's breath in her chest. The letter that stopped her breath was the one immediately beneath it, in a slightly different envelope, older, the paper a little yellowed at the edge, postmarked from the village post office on the 8th of September of the previous year. 5 days that was before Henry Ashworth had walked down to the lake after dinner and not come back. She did not open the letters. She did not need to. She lifted them by the ribbon, just a little, and saw beneath them, at the very bottom of the tin, a single, small object. It was a glass medicine bottle, empty. The label, in the careful copperplate of a country dispensary, read, "For Sir Henry Ashworth. The dose as prescribed, foxglove drops, to be taken as required for the heart." The bottle was empty. The cork was missing. A thin film of dark residue clung to the inside of the glass at the bottom. Eleanor sat very still in the wooden chair. The yellow-striped wallpaper sat very still around her. Outside, beyond the south lawn, the lake sat very still under a sky that had gone, in the last half hour, from grey to a curious silver. She thought, quite clearly, as one thinks when one has at last understood something one has been looking at for days. Henry's heart medicine. A bottle that should have been in his bathroom or his pocket, or in Dr. Pello's careful possession. A bottle that Cynthia had kept, with the letters from a man called Geoffrey, in a tin in a drawer in a room she went to in the afternoons to be quiet. A bottle whose contents, taken in the wrong amount or at the wrong moment, would slow a heart already weak, would slow it past recovery, would let a man swimming in cold water at night, who was not supposed to be swimming at all, go quietly under and not come up. She put the bottle back. She put the letters back exactly as they had been, the green ribbon at the same angle. She put the shawl back over them. She closed the drawer, she locked the desk. She put the key in her pocket. She wrote 3 more lines of her letter to her cousin in Bath because her hands were shaking and she needed them to remember how to do an ordinary thing. She blotted the page. She folded it. She put it in an envelope and addressed it. She went down the back stairs and along the corridor to Miss Marple's room. Miss Marple was in her chair by the window knitting. She looked up. "Yes, dear?" "Foxglove drops," Eleanor said. "His heart medicine, in a bottle in the drawer, with letters from Geoffrey." Miss Marple set down the knitting. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, the poor woman." Chapter 10. What the Garden Knew. That evening Lady Ashworth did not come down to dinner. She had a slight headache, Cynthia explained at the foot of the table, and Dr. Pellow had recommended a quiet evening upstairs. She would have a tray. Cynthia herself was a little tired, and would eat lightly. Roderick had gone into Dorchester after luncheon, and had not yet returned. Dr. Pellow, who had been with Lady Ashworth for half an hour after tea, accepted the offer of dinner and sat at the table in his careful, courteous way and praised the soup. It was, in effect, a dinner of 3, Cynthia, Dr. Pellow, and Eleanor. Miss Marple ate at the far end, a little apart, knitting again between courses in the manner old ladies had been allowed to knit at country tables since long before Eleanor was born. Eleanor, watching Cynthia across the candles, found that she could not stop looking at her hands. They were beautiful hands, long-fingered, capable, very pale. They had served the soup with practised neatness. They had broken a piece of bread in half with a small, precise gesture, exactly as one would break a piece of bread for a child. They were the hands, Eleanor realised, of a woman who had spent a great many years being extremely careful not to let anything spill, anything at all, of any kind, anywhere. 11 years of patience. A bottle of foxglove drops in a tin with 30 letters. A man called Geoffrey on the telephone last night, who had turned out in the gun room this morning to be Roderick using the name as a private taunt, but whose voice Eleanor now understood with a quite cold clarity, had probably not been the only Geoffrey to whom Cynthia Ashworth had ever spoken on the telephone. After dinner, Dr. Pellow excused himself and went up to look in on Lady Ashworth one last time before walking home. Cynthia accompanied him as far as the foot of the stairs, where they spoke in low tones for a minute, and then she returned to the drawing-room and rang for coffee. The maid brought it. Cynthia poured. The cups, the small white china cups with the gold rim, made their small precise sound against their saucers as she handed them round. "Cynthia," Miss Marple said, very gently after a little while, "would you walk with me for a few minutes? I should like a turn in the garden before bed. The roses are so very fine in the dusk, even now." Cynthia hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second. Eleanor would not have caught it a week ago. Now she did. "Of course, Miss Marple. Let me fetch a shawl." "Oh, do borrow mine. I have 2. The green one is in the hall on the stand. Please, Eleanor will give it you. I find I'm quite warm enough already." Cynthia took the green shawl. They went out together by the long French window, 2 figures stepping down onto the terrace, Cynthia tall and slim, Miss Marple small and rounded in soft grey, both of them moving with the careful, unhurried gait of women who had walked in country gardens all their lives. Eleanor stayed in the drawing-room. She had been told to. Miss Marple, on the way down to dinner, had said, "Whatever happens this evening, Eleanor, after dinner you're to stay with Lady Ashworth. Do you understand? You're to go up to her when Cynthia and I are in the garden, and you are to sit with her, and you are to not leave her alone for any reason until I send for you." So Eleanor, after a moment, set down her cup and went up. Lady Ashworth was awake. She was sitting up in bed in a pale wrapper with her grey hair down her back in a single soft plait, looking smaller than she had looked downstairs, smaller and older, and, Eleanor thought, considerably less frightened than she had been at any time during the past week. "Miss Crewe, sit down, my dear. Cynthia said you might come up." "Are you comfortable, Lady Ashworth?" "Quite comfortable. The headache is nothing. I told Cynthia it was nothing. I have been wanting, in fact, to speak to you. I have been wanting it since you arrived. Will you sit down?" Eleanor sat down in the small chair by the bed. Outside, the dusk had thickened. From the window one could just see the rose garden, the dark shapes of the standards, the pale path between them, and at the far end by the sundial, 2 figures walking slowly together. They were too far away for any face to be distinguished. They moved at the pace of an unhurried conversation. "You have been very kind," Lady Ashworth said. I have not perhaps been an easy patient. I have been trying. I have been trying for some months now to decide what to do, and I have not done it, and the not doing of it has worn me down rather badly. I think perhaps I shall do it tonight. Will you stay with me a little, Miss Crewe? I do not particularly want to be alone. Of course. Lady Ashworth was silent for some time. Her eyes moved to the window and stayed there. 48 years ago, she said at last, my husband's brother drowned in the lake at the bottom of this lawn. He had got a girl in the village with child. The family broke off his engagement to her. He drowned. Whether he meant to drown himself or not, no one knew. The girl had her child and went away. The child grew up. The child had a child. The child's child is, I have only this week understood, sitting downstairs eating my dinners and waiting to be paid. He approached Cynthia 3 months ago. Cynthia did not tell me. I learned of it by a letter from London which ought to have been opened by Cynthia and was, by mistake, opened by me. She looked down at her hands. I have known about Mary Trent's child, she said, for 46 years. I knew when I was 24 years old, sitting in this house as a young bride, that there was a baby in Plymouth who was my husband's nephew. I did nothing. I said nothing. I lived a long, ordered, good-looking life on top of that nothing, and when, last autumn, I at last decided that the silence had eaten too much of me to be borne, I altered my will, quietly, through Mr. Linnet. A small codicil, a sum of money, to be found, and given to whomever could be found, when I was dead, of Mary Trent's line. I told no one. I thought I had been very clever. I thought I had at last found a way to set right something that I had been too cowardly to set right, when it would have cost me something. She paused. Her hands tightened very slightly on the bedclothes. 3 weeks later my son died in the lake. She did not cry. Her voice did not break, but the look in her eyes, as she went on staring out at the rose garden, was the look Eleanor had seen on the faces of patients who had reached, after many days, the bottom of a particular kind of pain, and were sitting on the floor of it, surveying the walls. For 8 months, Miss Crewe, I have been trying to decide whether I killed him, whether someone in this house read my codicil and decided that Henry, who would have lost a few £100s by it, was an obstacle of some kind. I could not make the arithmetic come right. A few £100 is not a reason. But grief, you understand, does not require the arithmetic to come right. Grief only requires the answer to be possible. Outside, in the rose garden, the 2 figures had stopped by the sundial. Lady Ashworth was no longer looking at them. She was looking at her own hands. She said very quietly, "And tonight, Miss Crewe, I am going to ring for Mr. Linnet, and I am going to tell him to make the codicil public, and I am going to sit in this house in the morning while everyone in it learns what I have done, and I am going to find out, at last, who hated my son enough to drown him for a few £100. Because I cannot bear, you see, another night of not knowing." Eleanor said, very gently, "Lady Ashworth, it was not for the money." The old woman turned her head. "What did you say?" "It was not for the money," Eleanor said. "Henry was not killed because of the codicil. The codicil has nothing to do with it. I am very sure of that." Lady Ashworth stared at her. "Then why?" she said. "Then why?" Outside, in the garden, one of the 2 figures was walking back toward the house alone. Chapter 11. Everything that was not said. Miss Marple came in by the French window, set the green shawl on the back of a chair, and asked the maid for a small glass of brandy with hot water. She did not look distressed. She looked tired, in the careful, patient way of a woman who had been doing the work of 3 other people in her head for several days, and had at last set it down. She came up the stairs, paused at the door of Lady Ashworth's room, and said, "Edith, Cynthia is sitting on the bench by the sundial. She would like to come up in a few minutes, if she may, and speak to you. She has asked me to come up first because there are 1 or 2 things she finds it difficult to begin. Will you see her?" Lady Ashworth said, "Yes, Jane." Miss Marple sat down in the second chair by the bed. She glanced at Eleanor very briefly and gave the smallest possible nod. Then she folded her hands in her lap. "Edith," she said, "the codicil had nothing to do with Henry's death. So Miss Crewe has just told me. I confess I do not—" "Nothing at all. I have been very slow. I am sorry. I have been here a week, and I have only this evening in the garden understood it. The codicil is your guilt. It is not the cause of Henry's death. The cause of Henry's death is older than the codicil, and quite separate from it, and is a matter for which you bear no responsibility whatever. None. That is the first thing I want you to hear, and I want you to hear it before anything else." Lady Ashworth's eyes were very bright. "Tell me," she said. "Cynthia," Miss Marple said, "lost a child 11 years ago. A little girl. She was 18 months old. Her name was Anne. She died of croup on a bad winter's night in this house. The doctor was sent for. He did not come for 3 hours. He had been called to a confinement at the home farm, and there were reasons, Edith. He had not left a note for his housekeeper." Cynthia sat by the cot for those 3 hours alone. By the time he arrived, the child was dead. "Yes," Lady Ashworth said. "Yes, yes." The doctor was Dr. Pellow. There was a very long silence. "Cynthia has never spoken of it," Lady Ashworth said. She would not. After the funeral she put away the child's things and we never— No, she would not. She's not that sort of woman. She put it away. She put it down, the way she puts down everything. And for 11 years she was patient. Those were her own words. 11 years of patience. She loved her husband. She ran his house. She was kind to his mother. She took up no quarrel with Dr. Pellow, who continued to attend the family because to do so would have been to make a scene, and she was raised in a tradition that does not permit scenes. But she did not forgive him. Do you understand the difference, Edith? She did not make a scene. She did not forgive him. Lady Ashworth's hand had gone very slowly to her throat. "He attended Henry," she said. "He attended Henry's heart, Dr. Pellow. Yes. He prescribed foxglove drops, as required. A small amount can steady a failing heart. A larger amount, taken without warning in cold water, by a man already strained. Jane, Cynthia." "Cynthia," Miss Marple said gently, "did not poison Henry. I want you to be very clear about this, Edith. Cynthia did not give Henry an extra dose of his medicine. Cynthia did not put anything in a glass. Cynthia was, on the night Henry died, where she's been every evening of her married life, at this house, in her own drawing room, reading, with the maid bringing her tea at 9:30. Henry walked down to the lake alone after dinner. He had said he was going to swim. Dr. Pellow had been here that afternoon attending to your hip. Dr. Pellow had handed Henry in this very corridor a fresh bottle of his drops. Henry, who had been told 100 times not to swim, took the bottle to the boathouse. He took, as he often did, what he believed to be his usual dose. He went into the water. He did not come out. Then, the bottle Dr. Pellow gave him that afternoon, Miss Marple said quietly, did not contain his usual dose. Cynthia found this out 2 days ago. She has known since 2 days ago. She has not yet known what to do with the knowledge. That is what we have been speaking of, in the garden. Lady Ashworth's mouth opened and closed. "How?" she said. "How did Cynthia find out?" "By a letter from Dr. Pellow to her. One of many. He has been writing to her for some years. Letters she did not answer. Letters she did not destroy. They are not love letters. They are something else. They are the letters of a man who knows he was once, in this house, the cause of an unforgivable thing, and who has been trying, in a slow, patient, guilty way, to be forgiven for it. She kept the letters because she could not throw them away and could not answer them. 2 days ago, a new letter arrived. In it, Dr. Pellow, who's been sleeping less and less well since Henry's death, and drinking rather more than he eats at our table, you may have noticed, confessed to her, obliquely, in the sideways manner of a man who cannot quite say a thing outright, what he had done. He claimed it was an error. He may even, Edith, believe it was an error. The human capacity to believe such things about ourselves is very large. "He killed my son to be forgiven," Lady Ashworth said. Her voice was quite flat. "He killed your son," Miss Marple said, "because he was a guilty man who had been carrying for 11 years the weight of a child he had failed to save, and who had begun to believe, the way certain kinds of guilty men do, that the woman whose child it was would not love him, would not look at him, would not even quite see him, until he had, somehow, given her a debt of his own. I do not say he reasoned it through. I do not believe he did. I think he stood in this corridor on a September afternoon with a bottle in his hand, and he made a small, deliberate, unspeakable adjustment, and then he went home, and he poured himself a glass of whiskey, and he sat by his fire, and he did not, perhaps, fully understand until the morning what he had done. And Cynthia knows. Cynthia has known for 2 days. She has the bottle. She kept the bottle. She knew enough when Henry was brought up out of the lake to put the empty bottle in her pocket before any other person saw it. She has had it in a tin upstairs ever since. She did not know then what had been in it. She knew only that the bottle was empty when it should not have been, and that she did not wish a question asked about it in front of Dr. Pellow, who was kneeling on the landing beside her, weeping. She has lived with the bottle for 8 months. The letters arrived. She read. 2 days ago she understood what she had been preserving. Lady Ashworth closed her eyes. And tonight in the garden, she said, you persuaded her to come and tell you, yes. She will come up in a few minutes. She's a brave woman, Edith. She's a good deal braver than she's been allowed to be. She will tell you herself. And Dr. Pellow. Mr. Linnet will know in the morning, and in due course the police. There is a bottle, Edith, with residue in it, in a tin in a drawer, and there is a letter in a man's hand, and there is, although she has not yet told us this, although I am quite certain of it, a dispensing record in the village of the strength of the drops Dr. Pellow prepared on the afternoon of the 13th of September last year. The matter will not be obscure. It will only be slow. Such matters always are. Outside on the gravel path there was a soft footfall. Cynthia Ashworth came in through the bedroom door, very pale, the green shawl still over her shoulders. She did not look at Eleanor. She did not look at Miss Marple. She looked at Lady Ashworth and she said, "Mother, I have been very stupid. I am so terribly sorry." Lady Ashworth opened her arms. After a moment, with the slow, careful movement of a woman who had not allowed herself such a thing for many years, the younger woman crossed the room and went into them. Miss Marple rose quietly. She nodded to Eleanor. They went out together onto the landing, leaving the two women alone in the lamplight, and closed the door behind them with great gentleness. Chapter 12. A very reasonable explanation. Dr. Pellow did not come up to the house the next morning. He sent instead a note by his housekeeper's boy. The note was addressed to Lady Ashworth the elder, and it was very short. The note said only this: "I have known since Tuesday that Cynthia knows. I've been trying since Tuesday to write a letter that would explain what cannot be explained. I find that I cannot write it. I am going up to my brother's at Lyme. Mr. Linnet will know where to find me. I will not give any trouble." He had signed it with his full name. Beneath the signature, in a slightly less steady hand, he had written, "I am very sorry," about Anne also. Mr. Linnet read the note in the morning room with the green leather desk between him and the kitchen garden window. He read it twice. He folded it. He put it in his inner coat pocket. He said to Miss Marple, who was sitting opposite him with her knitting, "He will be at his brother's by luncheon. The brother is a clergyman in Lyme Regis, a very decent man. Pellow is sometimes there. He will not run, Miss Marple. He has not the temperament for running. He has the temperament for sitting in his brother's parlour and waiting for the constable. I shall telephone the chief constable this morning. The matter will go forward properly." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Yes, I am sure it will." "There will be," Mr. Linnet said, "a great deal of pain. For a great many people." "There already has been," Miss Marple said. "A great deal more than anyone supposed. I think the pain that is to come may, in some quiet way, be easier than the pain that has already been borne in this house, because at least it will be allowed to be pain now. For a long time it has had to be other things instead. I find that very tiring in a household. I am glad, on the whole, that it is over." Mr. Linnet did not speak for some time. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "may I say something? As one professional confidant to another, when I wrote to you last month I had no expectation of any of this. I had only the sense that something in this household was wrong, and the absence of any clear thing for me to do about it. I am very sorry to have brought you into a matter that turned out to be so much worse than I had any right to ask of you." "Mr. Linnet," Miss Marple said, "you did not bring me into anything. I came of my own choice. I have known Edith since she was a girl, and I have always liked her very much. I should not have forgiven you if you had not written. I should have forgiven you a great deal less, in fact, if you had thought that, because the matter was painful, you were not at liberty to ask an old woman in the country for her opinion about it. We are useful, Mr. Linnet, we old women. The world, in its way, was built on us. It would do well to remember that more often." Mr. Linnet smiled. It was a small, private smile, and it transformed his thin, ascetic face for the second time in 3 days. "I shall remember," he said. "Will you come back, Miss Marple, when this is all over? Lady Ashworth will need a friend." "She will have one. I shall come at Christmas. I shall stay for a fortnight. We shall be quiet." He stood. He kissed her hand in the slightly old-fashioned way of a country solicitor who had once been brought up to do so by a careful mother, and he went to telephone the chief constable. Miss Marple sat on, in the morning room that was no longer a morning room, with her knitting. She thought for a little while about Mary Trent, who had been a real woman and not a story, who had had a child and grieved a man and married another and died in Plymouth in 1915, and who had been, for 48 years, the small dark fact at the bottom of everything that had happened in this house. She thought about Anne Ashworth, the little girl who had died of croup 11 years ago in this house, and whose name had been almost the last word in Dr. Pello's note. She thought about Henry, who had insisted on swimming in cold water against medical advice, and who had been, by all accounts, not a remarkable man, but a kind one. She thought about Cynthia, who had kept a bottle in a tin for 8 months because she could not bear, alone, the meaning of it. She thought about Edith. She thought mostly about Edith, who had decided at 24 to know what was true, and to behave as though she did not, and who had spent 46 years living on top of that arrangement, and who had at last, very late in the day, tried to put a small part of it right. The arithmetic, Miss Marple thought, had not in the end come out the way Edith had feared. Edith had not killed her son. The codicil had not killed her son. The codicil had simply been the moment at which Edith had at last decided to be honest about her life, and that moment had happened to coincide, by no causal connection at all, with the moment at which Dr. Pello's 11-year-old guilt had become more than he could carry. 2 old debts had ripened in the same autumn. They had not ripened on each other's account. It was, Miss Marple thought, the saddest thing about the human condition that one was never given the privilege of understanding, while one was alive, which of one's actions had mattered and which had not. One simply went on doing them. One altered codicils and one prescribed drops, and one walked down to the lake after dinner. One died, or one did not. One found out, or one did not. The garden, in the meantime, went on producing damsons in their season, and the kitchen produced jelly from them, and the wool in the porch went on being wound into balls of varying neatness. She thought, with a small affectionate amusement, that this was the kind of thought she had often had as a girl in St. Mary Mead, sitting at the parlour window, watching old Mrs. Carraway walk her ancient terrier down the lane. She had thought herself very profound at the time. She no longer thought herself profound. She thought herself only old and tired, and rather glad to have been some use. She picked up the knitting. The shawl was very nearly finished. It was the soft heathered grey, and it would suit Edith, she thought, in the winter that was coming. Chapter 13. The Wool That Did Not Match. The story, in the village, took several weeks to settle into the shape it would keep. Dr. Pello was charged with the manslaughter of Sir Henry Ashworth at the autumn assizes. He pleaded guilty. He made no attempt to defend himself. He said in the dock that he had been a fool, and that he was very tired, and that he was grateful only that he had not made any further error before he had been found out. He was sentenced to 7 years. His brother, the clergyman in Lyme, attended every day of the trial, and walked out beside him after sentencing without speaking. Dr. Pello did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the seat in the second row, where Cynthia Ashworth sat in a black hat with a small veil. She did not herself give evidence. The prosecution did not require her to. The bottle, the dispensing record, and the letter were sufficient. Roderick went to South Africa, on a sum of money agreed between himself and Lady Ashworth, not the younger but the elder, over the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, with Mr. Linnet present and pouring the tea. The sum was less than Roderick had asked Cynthia for, and rather more than he had really expected to be given. He took it, signed Mr. Linnet's papers, and left for Plymouth the same evening. He wrote, the following spring, a letter from Cape Town in which he reported that he had been promoted twice, and was to be married to a perfectly nice girl whose father owned a small newspaper. The letter was addressed not to Cynthia, who had given him so many afternoons in the gunroom, but to Miss Marple, whom he had spoken to only once at a dinner table and had remembered. There was no obvious reason for this preference, except that he had probably understood at some moment who in that house had really seen him. Cynthia stayed at Ashworth. She did not, as a number of people had expected, leave it. She had nowhere particular to go, she told Eleanor on the last evening of Eleanor's stay, and she had at last begun to be in some ordinary ungrand way fond of her mother-in-law. And the house, which had been a house she had been guest in for 12 years, had, during this terrible autumn, become at last a house she lived in. She spoke of taking up the rose garden again in the spring. She spoke of perhaps having the lake drained and turned into something else. A water garden, an orchard pond, she had not yet decided. She did not think she would swim in it again. Eleanor went home to Bath at the end of October. Miss Marple stayed on a further fortnight, then returned to St Mary Mead by the slow afternoon train from Yeovil, with 2 jars of damson jelly in her basket and the soft heathered grey shawl half finished in her bag. She wrote to Edith every Sunday evening for the rest of that winter. The letters were short. They contained no advice. They contained, for the most part, accounts of the parish flower rota, and the shocking behaviour of a Mrs. Bantry's gardener, and the various ailments of the vicar's elderly bull terrier. Edith read each letter twice, and folded it into a small wooden box on her writing desk, and sat for a moment afterwards looking out at the lawn. The grief in her did not go. It did not do that. Ever. It changed only its weight in her by some degrees, and let her stand a little more easily under it. On the last morning of Eleanor's stay, before her train, Miss Marple walked her down to the front porch. The basket of wool was still there. The household had not yet decided what to do with it. Lady Ashworth did not knit any more, not since the night Cynthia had come up to her bedroom, and Cynthia had never knitted, and the maids had their own work. The purple ball still sat slightly apart from the others. "You see, my dear," Miss Marple said, looking at it, "I never did satisfactorily explain that, did I? I had wondered. It was Dr. Pellows. He had taken to bringing odds and ends of wool up to the house last winter, when he came to see her ladyship's hip. He had a sister who was a knitter in Bridport, and the sister was always sending him bits and pieces she did not want, because she thought he would find a use for them. He had no use for them. He brought them to the house. He left them in the basket. I think he could not bear, you see, to throw them away. They had been given to him, and he was a man who could not throw away anything that had been given to him with kindness. The purple was the last ball. He left it on the morning of the day Sir Henry died. I noticed it on the day I arrived. It did not match anything else in the house. I should have understood at once that it had been brought in by someone who did not really live here, and had never quite fitted in. But I am slower than I used to be, my dear. It took me 5 days. Miss Marple, Eleanor said, you are not slow at all. Oh, I am, said Miss Marple. I am quite slow. There was a man in my own village, you know. I don't think I told you about him, did I? A Mr. Catesby, who lived in the cottage opposite the post office for 23 years. He was a very pleasant retired schoolmaster. Everyone liked him. Quite late in his life it became clear that he had spent the entire 23 years quietly stealing parish funds in very small amounts by an arrangement with a former curate who had moved to Carlisle. We had, none of us, the slightest suspicion until the curate himself died, and a quite ordinary letter was found among his effects. Mr. Catesby was 68 by then. He paid back what he could, and was very contrite, and the matter was hushed, and he died not long after. I attended the funeral. I had known Mr. Catesby for 23 years, and I had not known a single true thing about him. I think of him very often. I think of him, in particular, when I find myself in a house where everyone is being charming. It is a useful habit, my dear, to remember Mr. Catesby. I commend it to you. The car came round on the gravel. Eleanor took up her case. Miss Marple, she said, thank you. No, dear, thank you. I should have managed it, I think, in the end on my own, but it would have taken me considerably longer, and Edith might not have had a fortnight more of it. You were a great help. You were exactly the right person to be in this house at this time, you know. That is rarer than you may think. She laid her hand for a moment on Eleanor's arm. The hand was small and warm and slightly worn, and the grip in it, when it briefly tightened, was surprisingly firm. Goodbye, my dear. Do come and see me in St Mary Mead. The damsons will be in again by next August, and I should very much like to give you tea. The car drove down the avenue. Eleanor looked back once through the rear window. Miss Marple was still standing in the porch, a small grey figure against the dark wood of the door with the basket of wool at her feet, and the purple ball still sitting slightly apart from the others, not yet thrown away, not yet wound into any garment, simply waiting, as small, unmatched things in country houses do for someone to decide, She lifted her hand once. Eleanor lifted hers. The gravel turned. The avenue closed behind them, and the long, quiet, ordinary work of the house, the lighting of fires, the sorting of linen, the slow folding of one autumn into the next, went on as it had gone on for 200 years around the few people who were left in it, and the few they had loved and the few they had lost.